if we are not talking about supply and demand, if we're not talking about consumption versus production, our kids will never understand the opportunities.
How can we rebuild the American economy? How can Black-owned businesses play a role? Today we visit Tulsa, Oklahoma, and learn what one community can teach the rest of us. I'm Victor Hwang, and welcome to The Start Show. Welcome to the first episode of The Start Show. The Start Show is part of Right to Start. We're a campaign to rebuild the American economy by fighting for entrepreneurial opportunity for all of us, regardless of background, race, place, genders, disabilities, or circumstances. We call them starters. It's not just tech entrepreneurs, they're everyday entrepreneurs. And all of us have a role to play in helping them. We're at a special moment in our history, folks. The pandemic has cost millions of jobs, forced millions of businesses to shut down, 22% of all businesses, and especially hard hit, 41% of Black-owned businesses. So where do we go from here? Well, at Right to Start, we're building a new civic infrastructure. That means better institutions, laws, policies, structures, systems, and person-to-person engagement to empower everyone's right to start. The Start Show is like a virtual road trip. We get to travel to other communities and see what's happening. Today, we're visiting Tulsa, Oklahoma. A century ago, Tulsa was one of the nation's booming centers for Black business. It was called Black Wall Street because of its vibrant economy. But 99 years ago, that community was destroyed. Over 300 African Americans were killed in a massacre, and that story was largely forgotten until recently. Today, we'll talk with people who are retelling that story and also revitalizing Black-owned businesses in Tulsa. We're also featuring local starters from Tulsa. I'll highlight two of them right now. One is Topeka Coffee, a coffee roastery here in Tulsa. I'm drinking their coffee right now, in fact. This is one of their best sellers, El Salvador Manzano Natural. And I've got to say, this is one of the most fragrant coffees I've ever experienced in my entire life. It's got notes of strawberry, melon, and almond milk, according to the package right here. It's absolutely delicious. We're also featuring Innovative Supplies, a startup business. You'll hear from them later in the show. They make school supplies that inspire kids of all diverse backgrounds. And here's one of their notebooks, which I'll be personally using in my work here on the Start Show and at the Right to Start campaign. Check out both of those starters, Topeka Coffee and Innovative Supplies. I'm thrilled today to chat with my dear friend, Cecilia Wessinger of Tulsa. Cecilia is one of my favorite people in the world. She's had a career in many areas of business, but in recent years, she's become one of the nation's most prominent advocates and activists for starters. Hello, Cecilia, and welcome to The Start Show.
I'm excited. I'm so excited for this movement, this show, the fact that Tulsa is in the spotlight. So that's exciting.
So tell me, you're not a native Tulsan, but you moved to Tulsa and you love Tulsa. Why do you love Tulsa? What makes Tulsa so special?
It's interesting. You know, I grew up in New York City, so already I come with a chip on my shoulder, and I come from a place where there's an incredible amount of amazing people. And I tell people, when I grew up in New York, there were lots of people that I admired, but it wasn't until I moved to Tulsa more than 20 years ago now that I actually found people that I wanted to be like. So I think it's the potential of actually making a difference that attracted me. And in speaking with a lot of people that have moved here recently with the Tulsa Remote Program, it's a lot of what they say. You know, they want to make a difference, and in Tulsa, they feel like they can.
And can you describe the Tulsa Remote Program just a little bit for folks that might not be familiar with it?
So the Tulsa Remote Program is funded by the George Kaiser Family Foundation, and the invitation is for people who work remotely to move to Tulsa for a year. They get connected with housing. Their benefit is $10,000. The interesting part is, you know, when they started this initiative, they thought that they would bring 20 or 30 people here the first little bit. And in 6 weeks, I believe they got over 10,000 applications.
So in the last month, there's been a lot of focus in Tulsa around the legacy of Black Wall Street and the race massacre that happened there 99 years ago. What is that? What's the impact of that today in Tulsa? I mean, that memory was forgotten for a long time, but now people are talking about it again. What does that mean for Tulsa today?
May 31st, 2021 will be 100 years. what is that legacy going to be? What have we done? And now there's more momentum and a call to action.
A century ago, Tulsa was one of the nation's leading centers for Black entrepreneurs. What did Tulsa miss out on over the last century of not
so
having
much. So much. We talk about diversity and building entrepreneurship, and the fact that we highlight so many specific stereotypical views of what entrepreneurs are. And so people like you and I grow up looking at people on the screen and people that are highlighted and never think, oh, that's something we could do. And I think that's a big thing about entrepreneurship. If you don't see people like you, then how do you know that it's for you, right?
Mm-hmm. Entrepreneurship seems to have become unintentionally kind of this privileged activity that only people that were lucky enough to have been surrounded by other entrepreneurs get to participate in. So I think it's interesting what you're saying, which is the legacy of Black Wall Street was affected not just by the massacre itself, which was horrible, but by the lack of ability of intergenerational sharing and learning and role modeling that happens because of it. So we have a question from a starter in Tulsa, Jessica Kinsey of Prodigy & Company.
I started Prodigy & Company so I could help nonprofits and social entrepreneurs increase their income so they can increase their impact. I want to know how we can better support these social entrepreneurs who want to find a balance between profit and purpose. What we can do to help the people who most want to benefit our community while also growing really solid businesses.
There's a servant leadership that goes into the idea of creating social entrepreneurs. The thing that we need is to build empathy around those movements. And sometimes it takes people like you that are not from here to hold up and shine a halo on the things that are happening. And it's getting advocates and finding allies to help bring that message forward. So it's a collaborative thing, I think, that to move social entrepreneurship forward.
So we have a question from Cheyenne Wheat of a startup company, Gaming the Museum, where they create immersive learning experiences for youth.
In thinking about the future of my career, I would love to work full-time on Gaming the Museum once I graduate, but I fear the financial burden will be too big of a risk. My question to policymakers is how might we provide equal opportunity and funding to underrepresented entrepreneurs?
So when questions like that come up around the burdens of people like Cheyenne who are college students, it makes me almost want to be a lawmaker to try to get legislation around things like lowering the interest rate for student loans and payback, or where there's some kind of grace allotted. I think that if policymakers were to maybe just check out America's New Business Plan, there are some wonderful ways that they could alleviate that burden. You and I talk about the fact that it doesn't mean that we want to make it easy. It's always going to be hard, but there could be easier, right? So there are ways that each of us can help entrepreneurs in making their path just a little bit easier. Like, it shouldn't be so dang hard.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cecilia. Thanks for being part of the Start Show.
Thanks for inviting me.
We're excited to visit two prominent leaders in Tulsa today. One is Rose Washington. She's the chair of the Tulsa Regional Chamber. She's CEO of the Tulsa Economic Development Corporation, and she was also recently the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. We also have Senator Kevin Matthews of the Oklahoma Legislature. He's a longtime entrepreneur himself and a public servant of many years. Welcome, Rose and Senator Matthews. So pleased to have you with us on the Start Show. How much has the Black Wall Street story shaped the legacy of entrepreneurship in Tulsa for both Black Tulsans as well as for all Tulsans?
In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we had over 30 Black-owned grocery stores, 21 restaurants, 2 hotels, 2 major theaters, and a transportation company just in North Tulsa. And none of those things are available today, but people did not know the story. And so when that story started to be told at the National African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C., 5 million people visited and started to learn about it. And so that has spurred a new interest in what we can do in Tulsa.
Senator Matthews, I think you founded or were a sponsor of the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission around the Greenwood legacy. Can you share about that and why that was important to tell the story, like you're saying?
We were looking at ways to enhance the area and tell the story. And so we formed a bipartisan commission to see how we could effectively tell that story and create an economic model around tourism, the fact that now we will be able to be part of the National Civil Rights Trail, bringing tourists here and learning about it. But not only that, being able to dialogue around solutions and reconciliation. And so that was the idea.
Rose, this would be a good segue to you. Over the past couple decades, how have you seen entrepreneurship revive, both in the Greenwood area, where Black Wall Street happened, as well as the rest of Tulsa?
I see really a new momentum behind business ownership. Of course, it is one of the greatest pathways to wealth. Senator Matthews and I actually met through a program that we created called Forward, Franchising Opportunities Reinforced with Assistance Rewards Development. And out of that program, we were intentionally attempting to help develop African-American businesses that would become owners in a small shopping center that we built in 2012. Out of that initiative, about 18 businesses started, and roughly 10 are located in the Shop Zone Peoria now, which is the development that we were creating. And so what we have to do now is just start working on building legacy type businesses owned by African Americans so they too can be passed on for generations to come. We have seen, as I said earlier, a lot of momentum behind African American business ownership. We have focused on a lot of place-based, geographic-centric business development. We've been very intentional about helping people start and grow, even to start thinking about entrepreneurship. And so in my time in Tulsa, I have seen enormous change.
Intergenerational wealth creation really depends a lot on the ability to build your own businesses. And entrepreneurship is really at the heart of that. But that seems like an issue that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Can you expand on that a bit, that idea of generational wealth that can get passed down and the role of entrepreneurship in the Black community? What
we want to do in the East Week that Rose has created is we're bringing parents and their children to learn about not only entrepreneurship, but financial literacy. Something as simple, Victor, as just having insurance on your business and life insurance and being able to pass something down to your children. Property, business, and wealth being passed down, that's not always understood. Many times in our communities, people die and they have a GoFundMe instead of life insurance or insurance on a business that when they pass away could automatically be passed down. But along with that, the next generation has to be taught in advance how to handle those resources, and that's what we're working on.
If we are not talking about supply and demand, if we're not talking about consumption versus production, our kids will never understand the opportunities. If we don't talk about the power of creation and how thoughts become things and how those seeds were planted for a reason, and if someone has a dream of entrepreneurship or of starting a business, that dream can become a reality, then they'll never pursue, or it's likely that they will not pursue those opportunities. And so just as we learn to crawl before we walk and walk before we run, we need to start instilling those values of economics and of actually entrepreneurship into the minds of our youth so that they have at least an opportunity to opt in versus being left out.
It's powerful. I think, it's not just intergenerational wealth creation, it's intergenerational knowledge creation that gets passed down, which actually the knowledge becomes sort of perpetual wealth creation in a way. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A question from Nika Brown, who is the founder and CEO of Innovative Supplies, which is a business building school supplies to help inspire children for the next generation.
I started my company to give back to my community and teach at-risk youth soft and hardworking skills, getting them ready for the workforce. I'd say to policymakers to create a national commitment to expanding access to capital.
I will tell you that the government plays a tremendous role in the work that we do. So we receive community development block grant funds from the city of Tulsa for the very purpose of economic development. Now, we use the funds for lending, but we lend to businesses that are starting and growing and creating jobs for low and moderate income individuals. The SBA, of course, has the micro lending program and their 504 program that are facilitated through intermediaries like TEDC. And there are a number of different programs that are available at different levels of government and in different agencies for this very purpose. And so government has a huge role. It's not about giving a handout, it's about extending a hand. It's not about giving people a fish, it's about teaching people how to fish. And that's really what we're all about.
Senator Matthews, can you speak to that issue of the role of government in expanding capital access for entrepreneurs?
Yes, Victor. As the past chair of the Oklahoma Legislative Black Caucus, we did research in transportation, and $8 billion over the next 6 years of road and bridge contracts. And of that, when we did our research, only 1/10 of 1% of money went to Black businesses in our state. 1/10 of 1%. The benefits of these businesses getting these contracts is self-sufficiency. You create more jobs, you create more people paying taxes, you create the opportunity for cities and states to grow their revenue.
I have another question from an entrepreneur named Obum Ukaban. He's the founder and executive director of Imagine Theater.
My question for policymakers is this: what are you doing specifically in the Black community to decrease this imposter syndrome that comes with creating and owning a viable business?
You can't listen to the naysayers. In fact, the grocery store that we broke ground on yesterday has been in the works, 3 or 4 years. Had I listened to the naysayers, I would have thrown my hands up 3 years ago. And so I'm very intentional about the work that I do, and I'm passionate about it, and no one is going to get in my way of delivering what I have set out to deliver. And so for Obum, my guidance and counsel is just to keep pursuing his dream, and it will become a reality.
Senator Matthews, you've been an entrepreneur. What would you say to Obum on this question?
I opened a franchise. I was working on the fire department at the time. And another current firefighter that started Tropical Smoothie Cafe in Tulsa. I had a classmate that started the UPS store in Tulsa. And that imposter syndrome and people feeling like that's not really the kind of business that a Black person could own, especially in a place like North Tulsa. Both of those businesses were still open right in front of the grocery store that's being built today. That Tropical Smoothie Cafe has been tremendously successful. And people said, you can't bring a franchise like that, fresh fruit and vegetable smoothies, to a place that people are not used to that. But he did it. He stuck with the plan. And now nobody calls him an imposter now. It's a staple in our community. The UPS store is a staple in our community. And so what happens is if you stay with it, those things that people are surprised about, they'll get used to. You need to get used to it and stick the course.
We've got our last two questions. These are the two standard questions we're asking all policymakers and leaders we talk with. The first question is, describe a starter who personally matters to you.
I had a young man come to me and say, you know, Senator, I've been watching you and you're doing a lot of great things, but people just don't know about it. This individual had a video marketing company, and his name is Lincoln Cochran. And Lincoln came to me and said, I'd like to magnify your message. And he started to meet with me, do 30-second segments, much like a television producer does, and started to do that through social media and other venues. And it made a significant difference for me. It's the first time in many times that I don't have an opponent, because people felt that I was doing a lot more when in all actuality, it was being marketed better. And so Lincoln Cochran.
Rose, what starter has personally mattered to you?
There's a place called Habit Boutique owned by a young woman named Shavonna Caldwell. Shavonna was not a part of the original Forward program, but she worked on a business plan for 2 years to develop this very specialized clothing boutique. And she has persevered. She continues to grow. She has fashions for every generation, every size, every height, but all for women. And so a shout out to Shavonna Caldwell at Habits Boutique.
Fantastic. And the second last question, what action will you take to help break barriers for starters? Senator, we'll start with you.
Well, the very next thing that I'm going to be embarking on is working with Rose and her E-Suite. And that is the opportunity for us to not only talk about, learn about business and legacy wealth management, but to have speakers that have experience to come before these individuals and these families, so that they have the type of mentorship that's necessary. We're going to be doing that together. That's going to be one of my top priorities.
Rose, what action will you take to help break barriers for starters?
We're rolling out something called Small Business University, university with a lowercase u. And through that program, which will also partially be delivered at the E-Suite, and the E stands for entrepreneurship, empowerment, anything positive that starts with an E at the shops on Peoria. Through SBU, we're going to continue to promote the growth in economic and business knowledge. We're going to promote development assistance, partnering with SCORE, which is a group of volunteer mentors and coaches who help people think through their business strategy. We're going to continue to deploy very creative and flexible capital to the companies that are starting and growing, and particularly to those who matriculate through our programming. And then we're going to continue to push for procurement opportunities and set-asides for minority businesses, so that they at least have the government support or access to contracts and grants with government entities that, again, happen to represent the largest share of gross state product in Oklahoma.
Well, thank you both. This has been a wonderful conversation. We're pleased to meet two starters in Tulsa today. One is Onika Nancy. She's founder of Fulton Street Books, a bookstore in Tulsa featuring stories of people of color and others that need to be told. She's also with the Kaiser Family Foundation. The other is Nancy Bruce of Lambrusco's Deli, a very popular restaurant in her neighborhood. She started the business 35 years ago and is still going strong. We're grateful to have them both share their stories and perspectives with us. Onika, Nancy, thanks for joining us here on the Right to Start show. So we're so excited to have you. Nancy, you were born in Tulsa. How has that changed over time? Tell me about what's happened in Tulsa over the years.
My mom and I started Lambrusco's in 1985. And at the time, Tulsa was all about the oil business. Everything was oil business. Everything was oil business driven. And it wasn't very long after that till that crashed. And I think that's when Tulsa really started to change. Because if we didn't diversify, we couldn't survive very many more of that oil business ebb and flow. And that's when people really got interested. And then I think in the last decade, we focused on not necessarily just finding outside industry, but we focused on our strength, which is the arts, the Deco District. We have amazing philanthropists here that are making this a better place to live. And it's made drastic changes in the last decade.
That is so exciting to see those changes. What would you say are still some of the hardest struggles for starters in Tulsa that are trying to start stuff out?
Yeah, I think one of the most shocking things to me was being a Black woman entrepreneur in Tulsa, even as someone who has access, as someone who works for one of the largest foundations in the state, still having challenges and barriers to access funding to get started. So I think while Tulsa is touted as one of the best places for entrepreneurship, and I think there's a lot of opportunity here, we still have challenges when it comes to racial disparities, especially when it comes to accessing funding. We have disparities that are divided by race in every segment of our community. So that, of course, is still very present in entrepreneurship as well.
One of the things we want to highlight in the Start Show and with the Right to Start is all these unseen barriers that entrepreneurs have to deal with. I think of entrepreneurs as these invisible heroes having to fight to build these businesses every day. And it's usually unrecognized. Nancy, can you talk about the struggles you're facing in Lambrusco's? I know you started a few years ago, but what are some of the things you're dealing with now?
It remains the same. I think it's sad when I hear Onika talk about how difficult it is for women of color to get financing, anyone of color to get financing, and women to get financing. I saw men around me everywhere getting financing when I needed financing to start my business, but it wasn't available to me. It wasn't available to me unless I had real estate as collateral. Then it wasn't available to me. So I went into business because I love to cook, and I wanted to see if there was any way I could make a living doing what I love to do. And people now go into business to say, how quickly can I make this business look profitable so I can sell it, make a lot of money, and go do something else? And those are your two businesses, and that makes it it's a hard place to compete when your goals are so completely different. Mine is to make a good living for 22 people and make a nice enough living for myself. And it's not necessarily to sell the business, and you run your business differently if you're not running it to sell it.
Mm-hmm. What would, if both of you could change one thing to make it easier to start being an entrepreneur, what would that be? Like if you could make your dream wish come true? Wow.
I think we have to have avenues to invest directly in people. I think a lot of organizations and programs that are set up to support entrepreneurs need to be willing to take risks. When it comes to Black, Indigenous people of color, there's a perception that the risk is higher. And I've not seen data to suggest that it actually is. So I think we just need people who are willing to take the risk and invest directly in people instead of building systems that always end up inequitable in the end. So investing directly in people.
Yeah, it's interesting. The data actually, I think, points the other way, that there's huge unrecognized value among women, people of color, a lot of underrepresented groups, and that's value that's unlocked for our communities and for our country. It's just people that have great talents and abilities that can't realize their full potential. It's leaving money on the table. And Nancy, how about you?
You realize too, when I started business, I didn't know what percentage my labor was supposed to be. I didn't know what percentage my food cost was supposed to be. So we can Google and get some of that information now. But there's valuable information that if we had access to some accountants, investors, if all that was encompassed so that we got the information up front to let us move forward, I think we would have so many fewer failures. But
it is true that, business requires you to call on like all these skills. And so it takes a community, it takes a team, it takes a community, it takes a village to put a business together. This is the last question. What if you could offer one piece of advice to someone starting out or thinking of building a business or launching a new effort, what would that one thing be?
The one thing I would say specifically to young Black entrepreneurs is take the leap, take the jump and do it. Our community has for so long built so much with so little, and the world requires that thing that you desire to bring to life. And so it would be an injustice to allow the structural systemic barriers that have been put into place to prevent you from opening your dream, from opening your business. So take the leap, take the jump, know that your community will support you, so do it.
This is great. Thank you both. I really appreciate your perspectives and what you've shared. This is powerful stuff, and the story needs to be told. So thank you, Onika and Nancy. Before we go, we're going to close out the show with music from Count Tutu. Tell us a bit about Count Tutu.
So Count Tutu is a wonderful band here in Tulsa. They came together, a lot of them around the University of Tulsa, and local musicians that jam together. They're a fun representation of just what can happen when you get a bunch of really wonderful people bringing their gifts. I think that's basically the story of Tulsa, right?
FaceTiming together, still feeding each other, sending words of encouragement through the internet. Organizations backing musicians, meditation